Hi everyone. So welcome to the second series of videos where we're going to today, where today we're going to be covering Jungian, aka analytical psychology. So before I begin the slides, again, the psychodynamic theories can be seen to be extremely weird and kind of antithetical to many of the other theories that are grounded more in empirical and research-based methods. The thing to remember with these theories is how they were developed. Um, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, with the birth of Western psychotherapy, is essentially how those processes worked. Is classic psychoanalysis pertain to this idea that you would meet with the client multiple times a week, 3 to 5 times a week, for an hour each time, and the client essentially would well, the technical term is free associate, but what that means is they would just say whatever comes to their mind. And so if you think from your own experiences with friends or family, certain part in a conversation, uh, the conversation get really interesting and rather weird when we're given the opportunity to talk whatever comes to mind. A lot of information, sometimes tangential or sequential information, can come into play. So what was happening with these models is they were seeing clients first, and then after all that material was presented, they were trying to make sense of it. Freud and the psychoanalysts tried to make sense of what people were talking about in sessions through at that time, a late 18th century biological model, essentially really influenced from evolutionary theories of the late 1800s. So that's why Freudians are really focused on energy, past history, as well as the importance of sexuality, because they that at that time was a core element of evolutionary theory. So with that, now in today's world, psychoanalysis feels very anti-biology, but that is its foundation as a biological sense. Going to what we're going to talk about today, Carl Jung and the Jungian, the analytical psychologist, trying to understand what their clients were presenting and the growth and change factors of their personality, they incorporated understanding folklore, mythology, religion, and spirituality, and even alchemical history, which alchemy is a precursor to chemistry. And alchemy is essentially transmitting different materials into new substance. So it's all about transformation, into helping explain what's occurring in sessions. And then when we get into Adler and the Adlerians were heavily based off more social theories of that time period, influenced by Marxism, sociology, especially the French school of sociology was being developed. And in addition to that, too, understanding kind of the importance of family and relations when we come into that. So as we begin this, let me share this slide, but that's the framework to understand is all of these theories are greatly based off kind of trying to make sense of stuff after we observe it. And with that, our own biases are going to come into play. And all the theorists of the psychodynamics, their own perspectives and their own histories impacted how they made sense of what clients were talking about in a therapy session. So if I share my screen, all right. So again, this is on Jungian analytical psychology, probably the most complex personality theory out there that we will be discussing in this class. So to give some overview of analytical psychology, again, it's based off Carl Jung and his followers. Carl Jung doesn't have a litany of followers that Freud does, um, but there's been, in addition, if you become more interested in these models, Maria von Franz, Eric Newman, I'm forgetting his first name, there's also Fordham, and then James Hollis, Robert Johnson, just to name a few. But there's not, like I said, not a huge litany of additional theories compared to the Freudians and the psychoanalysts. So as I mentioned, the foundation of these models to make sense of how clients were growing and changing in a session was using spirituality and a myth and mythology, as well as other kind of spiritual and parapsychological practices as an understanding to how one's personality in psychology works. So this is a highly complex approach, but in a nutshell, we have to understand that the core of this is humans contain paradoxical parts. And the biggest thing to remember with this, if you is to remember that humans have an unlimited potentiality of how their personality can transform into. If you think of the worst person that possibly comes to mind, as well as the best person that possibly comes to mind, from these perspectives, you have the ability to become either of those individuals. Within us has the ability to, for our personality to be expressed in numerous ways. So that's this idea there's unlimited growth, there's unlimited possibility. And there's going to be paradoxical parts of our personality. And when they're paradoxical, that can cause conflict. And we need to find a way to find that balance. So essentially, all of the majority of psychodynamic theories is we're complex people with different complex and paradoxical parts internally. So we can find a way to strive for balance. So balance is going to be the key. So the goal of this theory is to become individuated. And what that means is we want all our internal working parts harmony with each other, which is reaching our true potential. So we haven't covered the humanistic theories yet. But next module, we'll be talking about person-centered humanism and other humanism elements, where the goal in those capacities is to become self-actualized. Individuation and self-actualization have many similarities. And both of these concepts believe that we have the potential, or excuse me, to rephrase that, innately, we're born with a potential, and we're striving to become that potential. And from both humanism and analytical psychology, part of the growth process through our life is to reach that potential. So what's interesting and I think very important for this model is understanding how personality growth occurs. Within our society and Western culture, we tend to look at growth being linear, or at least strive to be linear. And what I mean by that is we're hoping that it's always going up, that it's a linear process of our growth. But when we look at how people change and grow, it is more of a spiral. And what I mean by that is there are many times individuals will develop new traits and feel rather content about themselves, but life happens. And so if we look at this spiral, we can start feeling good, feeling like we're in a good place, everything's going pretty well. And then what starts to happen is we start to dip. And then we reach a point going down, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, called the abyss. And that's the end point of the spiral. Here is a key point from an analytical psychology perspective. If we can get through the abyss, those very difficult times in our life, maybe we're dealing with a mental health concern, maybe just even socially it's a difficult time. If we can get through that abyss, that's where we're going to grow. And then next time the spiral increases. So we grow and develop as a person. And again, we're going to be prepared for the next time we go into the abyss. So from this perspective, we are going to confront the abyss many, many times. But by doing the work, knowing ourselves, knowing how to be resilient and get through the abyss, it's going to be a little easier possibly each time, but there is always the concern we will stay in the abyss. So sticking with this, personality occurs as not linear. There's going to be times where we still feel like we're regressing, so going back to who we were originally, or there may be some social events or situations in our life that are very difficult. Those difficult time periods is where growth can occur if we can find a way to learn from those experiences. So, another positive or a view to consider with this, again, this is a clinical model. Traditionally, analytical psychology viewed symptoms or psychopathology resulting as an opportunity for growth. So there's a positive view of this, that yes, symptoms such as depression, anxiety can definitely be negative and impactful, but the Jungians viewed it as an opportunity to grow from it, that there was some sort of element or reason why this exists, and this gives an opportunity to grow. So what we'll see with the next slide, many of you may be familiar with this. This is what we call the heroes, or I use the term heroic journeys because there's been quite a bit of literature talking about heroes, heroines, and other perspectives of this journey. So I'm using a catch-all with this, but understand the photo I am using is specific to Joseph Campbell's, but there are many different type of journeys one can go on. But what I want to focus on is this is similar to the spiral. So when we're feeling well on top of the spiral, we're in the known, or what we also call the mundane. Things are going pretty well, and we're feeling rather stable. And what starts to happen is there is the call of going into the unknown. And that could be some sort of symptom, just some sort of feeling that something is not right, some sort of life event, some sort of social event, etc. And then we start on the journey or into the unknown. So that's things outside of our awareness. So again, this is a psychodynamic perspective. So remember, psychodynamics is all about growth is going to occur by increasing our awareness, making the unknown known. So in this journey in life, there's going to be times we start stepping into the unknown. So we go from the mundane to the novel, something new, something we have not maybe experienced before or not familiar with. What happens is we start entering a point where we may need assistance in our lives. So there's a pro-social element of this. Could be a helper, could be a mentor to help us with this journey. We can also use this journey to understand the counseling and psychotherapy process. Many times when people start going on this journey, this is when they seek counseling or psychotherapy. The nature of counseling or psychotherapy is the role of the therapist is to be a guide rather than give direct advice. I can't go on the journey for the client. I can assist the client, but the client's role is to be on that journey themselves. And there's sometimes, so that, excuse me, I kind of jumped ahead of myself, but that's the key to remember this. This is our own unique journeys. We can get assistance for it, but we have to continue the journey on ourselves. Someone else can't do it for us. So as we continue, we hit the low point of the spiral, and that's the abyss. Okay. Now, this is the key element, and we see this in various media portrayals as well as various folklore traditions, mythologies, and stories. That a lot of times the heroic individual or the main character has a lot of similarities with the protagonist. So, for example, Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter and Voldemort have a lot of similarities. Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, Frodo, and Smeagol from Lord of the Rings. All of those characters, what happens is they too went on some sort of journey to learn more about the unknown. They entered the abyss, but the villain stayed in the abyss. They couldn't leave it. They were transformed. The abyss leads to transformation. So you're either going to stay in it and you become the villain, you become controlled by the shadow, and they never leave the abyss. Where the idea with the hero or the heroic individual is that they enter the abyss, and they can leave it transformed as a new person with growth. So again, that's the key with this. There's many people, when they enter the abyss, they get stuck in it, and that can lead to a lot of devastation in their lives. The goal would be finding a way to get through the abyss. If we can get through the abyss, that's where the learning and growth is going to change. That's for the transformation. So as we continue up the spiral, we're going to return to a transformed growth individual person, back to the mundane, back to the known. And then there's a possibility we're going to go back on this journey as well. So we want to find a way, when we're in those low points, how can we get through them? When we're covering in module 4, we'll get more into existential, and positive psychology of this idea, talking about resilience. Resilience is, how do you overcome barriers with this? So the thing to remember going forward with the clinical theories is that all of these abilities can be learned. They're not innate. So you can always learn to be resilient. You can always learn to overcome those barriers. There's that self kind of motivation, self-leadership component, self-openness of, okay, I'm in this situation. What can I do to get through this? It's sometimes it's seeking assistance. Sometimes it's going on our own personal growth and journey. Whatever it may be, we don't want the situation to consume us and lose our individuality, because that's what the abyss will do. So again, the villains are going to lose themselves in our media portrayals and become something new. The abyss takes them over. We don't want to lose our individualness. We want to grow from it rather than lose it. Okay, so that's kind of the framework. A lot of analytical psychology, because it's based off mythology, spirituality, religion, etc., folk uses a lot of analogies with those media or traditional sources to kind of paint a picture of how personality grows and develops. So with this too, this is one of the first clinical theories that greatly utilize personality traits to help understand working with clients in a psychotherapy or counseling session. So throughout Jung's career, like all the theorists we've talking about, there's going to be additions and changes they make. So Jung had 3 distinct classifications of personality throughout his lifetime. And from the 3 major schools of psychodynamic thought we're talking about, Jung lived the longest, all the way up to the 1960s. So he had a pretty prolific career. So his first major personality model was that humans have 2 separate personalities. Okay, so we have personality 1 and we have personality 2. Personality 1, that's the one most people see and is an external. Okay, so this is the one that people can observe. This is one people can understand. And so then we have personality 2. Personality 2 is an element of our personality that's more internal and only we experience. So if we go back to assignment number 2 about asking informants to describe your personality, when someone else is describing your personality, that can be personality 1. When you are trying to describe yourself, that could be personality 2. That could be why there may be a disconnect. In addition to that, it's very common that when we're taking personality assessments, there may be an internal conflict when we're given a multiple choice or some sort of test and asked a question. We may have this internal conflict of, well, it all depends on where I'm at. And that can be this integration between the personality 1 and the personality 2. So we're going to have an element of an external personality that we present, that people see, and then we're going to have an internal world. So again, as we'll go forward with this typology, there's always a duality. So I'll have an internal and an external component. So the second development of Jung was the psychological types. So this is the Myers-Briggs that many people are familiar with. So we have extroversion, introversion, sensation, intuition, and thinking and feeling. And then judging and perceiving, that was added specifically to the Myers-Briggs type, and is not the original element that Jung wrote about. So the thing to remember with extroversion and introversion within our modern kind of speak, currently, extroversion, introversion, a lot of people interpret it meaning, whether or not you like being around people. So extroversions are more outgoing, introversion is more shy. This is a different perspective of those terms. This is not necessarily about whether or not you like people or whether or not you're shy. This is based off what recharges you energetically. Okay. What do you need to kind of for self-care or feel recharged? Because there's moments when we're feeling exhausted. Extroverted types or extroversion, we get recharged by being around others, having conversations, doing activities, being more recharged in the external world. Okay. Introversion is more recharged by reflecting inwards, whether it's mindfulness, reading a good book, quiet time, taking a stroll in the woods, or maybe even having a deep conversation one-on-one. So again, it has nothing to do with being shy or being outgoing. It's more what energies recharge you. Do you need more external uh, energy to recharge or more internal? And then finally, the third progression of analytical psychology is the influences of complexes and archetypes. So we'll cover those as well, but then what we get to is the model of the psyche that it gets really complex and we'll have different parts internally. We'll have the shadow, the persona, the self, just to name a few. There are more, but I don't want to get stuck in the weed and the quagmire with certain of these. And depending on the school of thought of analytical psychology, some use more than others. You may be familiar with anima and anime. Anima is the female energy, and animus is the male energy of our psyches. That's the original model, but again, there's different branches of these components. Some do and some don't include them. There's other elements of the psyche, like the psychoid, but these are the most common ones we will cover. Okay, so again, here's the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Many of you may be familiar with this. What I want to talk about real quickly is from an analytical psychology standpoint, you may have a dominant type. Okay, that's going to be our personality one. But understand you also internally have the ability to express the opposite components. So if I stick with ISTJ, that also means I, at times, even though I'm more introverted, I'm more sensitive, I'm more thinking and judging, at times, and depending on the situation, I could easily become extroverted. I can easily become intuitive. I can easily become feeling and having perception. What happens is many of us, our personality structures become rigid. And if we become rigid, it may be more difficult to deal with the ever complexity of life. And so again, we're striving for balance. We want to have the ability to have different personality traits being expressed when needed. And that's the goal of individuation, is learning who we are as a person and understanding that, hey, there's going to be times that it's going to help me more if I'm more feeling based rather than thinking based at this moment, and vice versa. There'll be times when it's going to be helpful for me to gain energy from being in more public situations that can promote socialness, that can promote support, that can learn from others. And there's also going to be times where I can really learn who I am from going within and reflecting on that. So this is the big contention of traditional analytical psychologists and Myers-Briggs users, because the Myers-Briggs really emphasizes this idea that your traits should be consistent throughout your life, because that's the whole purpose. If I give you a personality test, it is assuming that this is going to be consistent throughout different situations. But the Jungians disagree with that. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be more striving for balance and focus. So understand that within this world of analytical psychology, there's a lot of debate about the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And there's also debate about the validity of this test. The one thing I want to add, and many of you mentioned it in our discussion post for assignment number 2, this is used very frequently in job settings or workplace settings, as well as online. There's many resources with this. What I would want to say, though, is this is used quite a bit by people who don't necessarily have a strong training or foundation in what these types are based upon. And so always take something, any personality assessment, take it with a grain of salt, because many times it is utilized without a strong foundation of what we're actually testing. And I don't want you to feel like any personality test is deterministic. That's not how these things are designed. It is a snapshot of what's happening in some sort of anchor or guidepost to make sense of the complexity. So again, just be aware of that, because in addition to, anyway, I'll stop there. I could rant on forever, but just remember that from this model, there's always the potential to grow and have different traits being expressed. Okay, so this, again, Jungian stuff is way more complex than Freud. So remember, with Freud, we had 3 parts of our psyche: ego, superego, then id. There's much more, and this is a more complex element. But what we have is we're going to have, if we go back to like a personality 1, we're going to have elements that are conscious and elements that are unconscious. So as we'll talk about in a little bit, there's going to be many layers to this. Really, the center of this is we're going to explore what we mean by persona, what we mean by self, and what we mean by shadow. Ego is mentioned, and it's very similar to the Freudian ego. But so if we look more at this, we're dealing with the interactions between the external world and the inner world. And though that's what makes up who we are, is that interaction from the external and the internal. And we always can grow and change. For whatever reason in our society, there is this like narrative that your personality is fixed at a certain age. That's not true. And traditionally, this model of therapy or personality development, Jung traditionally felt that the growth really occurs after the age of 50. And this model, one of the very few that was designed to be used for people past midlife. And he felt that's really where the personality is going to grow and develop. And so that's something to keep in mind. There's always potential for growth and change. So with this model, there's going to be 2 types of the unconscious. Again, there's always a duality. So we're going to have a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious. The personal unconscious of this model is very, very similar to Freud's model of the id, ego, and superego. So the personal unconscious is going to contain your memories, feelings, and psychic parts that are kept out of your awareness, but something you experienced in your lifetime. And it's still going to express itself symbolically, and it's connected to, again, what you have experienced. Okay. The next part, this may be very a different perspective than what many people are used to. The collective unconscious is this idea that within our personality is influenced by stuff that we have not experienced outside of us. And inherently, what the collective unconscious views, all humans are going to share a common collective history. So think of it like the DNA and epigenetics for personality, symbols, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And so what's going to happen in addition, depending on our family history, our cultural history, the time period we're born in, there's going to be specific and cultural elements that may represent who we are. And we can see this with how um, different mental health concerns are presented differently depending on the culture that one experiences. For example, when we look at individuals who may have auditory hallucinations of voices, what we can see is depending on the culture, those voices can either be positive or negative. Traditionally, and what's very common in the United States, voices can be rather scary, threatening, and commanding. So those auditory hallucinations are more disruptive and negative. Where if we go, there's been studies looking at certain regions of Africa and Asia, where auditory hallucinations are more supportive and feel more ancestral, coming from ancestors, and are more positive. And obviously, that's going to have an impact, possibly, on how one feels a response to this. In addition to the cultural element of, if I take what we would classify as symptoms of the schizophrenic spectrum, in the United States, we medicalize that and see it as something that's not normal. And so that could impact someone's growth and development, where other cultures may see that as more of a positive development and may put them in roles that some societies would call it as shaman or healer or possible guide, etc. And so those individuals more likely going to function better if the society sees those as a strength rather than a weakness. So with this too, the collective unconscious, it is a framework to possibly explain when we have group phenomenons that occur, group hysteria, group conformity, and why certain symbols and motifs are seen throughout culture and time periods. In addition to this too, the collective unconscious can help us understand why symbols can greatly impact and connect with people in a certain time period. So those are those two elements with this, and how this is going to look in a therapeutic or counseling context is when working with clients using this framework, we can understand, especially when analyzing dreams, that some dreams are going to more represent the person of who they are, and others are going to represent collective unconscious components. So a good rule or an example of this is we have little dreams and big dreams. An example of a big dream is if you ever woken up and you're like, damn, I feel like I need to talk about that dream, or just felt, whoa, that dream, something about this dream really stuck out to me or is resonating with me. I just can't shake it. That's a big dream. And sometimes those big dreams are going to have collective unconscious components. So the next thing I'm going to say, to take this with a grain of salt, but this is used a lot to explain in the Jungian sense of some interesting phenomenon therapists see when working with clients. It was quite written about by many analysts before World War I and World War II, that they were having a lot of clients have dreams about a lot of bloodshed in Europe. And so they thought these were people were picking up on all the stress and tension that was going on that led up to these major catastrophic events. So again, we always want to take that with a grain of salt. We can't prove it, we can't disprove it. Something that I experienced too, and again, I can use this framework to make some sort of sense with it, but I will never truly know what I'm going to say if this is true. So fall of 2019, like December of 2019, or excuse me, more early winter or winter of 2019 to early 2020. I was at a college center, and we keep really rigid statistics of seeing how many crisis sessions we have and how and what people are saying there's their presenting concern. And at this time period, we were seeing a massive increase of anxiety And there was actually quite a few clients I worked with who were coming in very fearful of a global pandemic. This was, again, 2019. Okay. December, November of 2019, I had multiple clients come to me talk about fears of a global pandemic. And at that time, it was out of our worldview in a way. So, in addition to our crisis appointments went up by 300% in this time period. And there was a lot, in addition to worries about pandemics, there was a lot of anxiety and meaninglessness and existential crisis. And it was again, when we looked at other statistics compared to other previous semesters, this was an anomaly. So, from a collective unconscious viewpoint, people were picking up the major socio-political events that were about to come to be, that energy with this. So whether or not that's true, can never prove it. But in this idea that there is this possibility that within a collective unconscious is picking up on things that are starting to brew up and come into play. So moving on specifically to the elements of our unconscious. The first is persona. So this is the masks we wear or the social faces we present to the world. So think of it like the roles that we may have, and we can identify with those roles. So student, friend, job title. It's very common that you're going to be a different person depending on the social context and who you're with. So a lot of times too, these personas are typically used to please others and hide our true self. And we can even hide our true self from ourselves using personas. So again, we're going to act differently in different situations. So we want that balance, because what can happen is we can become that persona. And we call that persona identification or de-individuation. We become who we're trying to be, or we become strictly that role. So we can see this if someone identifies more in their career and they start in every situation, that's their true identity. So let's say someone, identifies as a lawyer, and even when they're not in that role, they act like a lawyer to their friends. They act like a lawyer when they're seeing a doctor. They act like a lawyer with their family. They have de-identified themselves and have become that persona. And that can cause a rigidity and possible issue in their life. So we want that balance of having a persona, but also not losing ourself. So persona, that's more how we interact externally. So we have the persona, that's more personality one. Now, back behind us is the shadow, okay? The shadow from this model is going to contain both personal, so things we've experienced, as well as collective unconscious material. So earlier I mentioned that if you think of the worst and best person that comes to mind, you have the potential of becoming that person. That potentiality exists in the shadow. It's anything essentially that we are not becoming aware of. So it's elements of ourselves that we do not want to admit we have, including both positive and negative elements. So the shadow can no doubt be very scary, and we confront the shadow when we go through the abyss. And by going through the abyss of the heroic journey, that's where we can find gold in the shadow. So here's the image of a dragon. And there's many stories of dragons typically protecting some sort of treasure. So the dragon can be that scary thing that we want to face, but by exploring and addressing the dragon, we can find the gold. The gold is the growth and transformation. So in order to develop as a person, we must interact. And again, the must comes strictly from this model. We must interact with the parts we're afraid of. This is how we grow. We confront our own weaknesses, our own biases, our own confrontation. So the thing to remember, just like if we get stuck with our persona, if we ignore the shadow is going to find a way to consume us. So if we ignore our weaknesses or our biases, there's a potential that we become overtaken by the shadow. I'm sure you can think of people in pop culture or maybe in your own lives who they've kind of lost control and are more being activated or seem like controlled by these more personality forces. So that's the thing, is we have to confront the darkness. That can be really, really uncomfortable to explore things that scare us. So real quickly, let me just grab this item. So a lot of my training comes from Jungian play therapy, and connected to this concept in Jungian play therapy, the play therapist always wants to have an item in their room that scares them. So this is a Mothman figure. I don't know if you can see it well. So Mothman scared the crap out of me as a kid. And so because my role as working with clients, I'm asking them to confront things that scare them or are difficult. It's required that I have something that also scares me, because it's going to be hypocritical. If I can't confront my scary demons, I should not be able to ask other people to do that. That's how we're going to grow and develop as people. So the next component is archetypes. Many of you already may be familiar with this, and depending on the specific school of analytical psychology, there's going to be different definitions of how we describe them. Essentially, what they are, they're cultural images that contain strong emotional and psychological meaning and themes. Now, there's another pure Jungian definition, but I don't want to get lost in the weeds. We're just going to stick with this one for now, but understand there's different definitions of archetypes. So many times the archetypes are going to come from the collective unconscious. And this is why we can see a lot of similarities, and why certain media campaigns can be really impactful of addressing other individuals. And if we think of any media that has impact us on an emotional level, that can be an archetype. So we can interact in archetypes in the external world. So working with these symbols through the media, or the internal world. Archetypes can overcome us and we can play out the archetypes. So from this model, an archetype can almost take over one's personality, and their personality can almost become that way. And many times the archetype is activated and we're acting a certain way and we don't have the awareness of that. We're kind of getting swept up in the moment. So archetypes can both have positive and negative elements. If we're typically someone who's afraid of a situation but get overtaken by an archetype that's courageous, that can be beneficial, and vice versa. One way to think about archetypes is, if you have to describe a character without using their name, how you would describe him could possibly be an archetype. And there's almost like an infinite amount of way to describe archetypes. But the key thing to remember is, with our own personal development, we want to have a lot of options. We want to find balance between things. And so exposure to various archetypes is so important. So because for external archetypes help develop our internal world and vice versa. And also it can help us become possessed, quote unquote, by the internal archetypes. So art, media, literature is very important to personality development from a psychodynamic perspective. In addition to that, we want to be exposed to as many archetypes as possible. So that's why even representation in media is so important. Okay, so the final, or I shouldn't say final, the major part, another component of the unconscious from a Jungian view, is the self. So deep in our personal unconscious contains the self, and the self also has elements of the collective unconscious too. This part, as I mentioned, is going to have 1 foot in our personal unconscious and 1 foot in the collective unconscious. So the goal of life is for the self to be developed. The self is going to become expressed when there's a unity and harmony between all psychic components within us. So there's that balance. We can go from one or the other, and there's less rigidity. So we call that individuation. That's a process of integrating the complex and bipolar, and I mean bipolar from those two extremes. Bipolar in that we have positive and a negative. And so that's what we mean by that they exist in all of us. So individuation is the goal of life and is the ability to simultaneously be able to identify with ourself and identify with that other. So again, that's that polarity. I have me, but I also want to identify with others. I don't want to lose myself in a certain circumstance, others, and I want to respect other people's own selves. This is going to be similar to social interest from Adlerian element, and we're going to see in humanistic model, self-actualization has many similarities to this as well. In addition to this is going to happen naturally, and we just need the environment to support us. That's going to be a key theme in humanistic theory in module 5. So I'll talk more about that then. So the other things I want to talk about too, because analytical psychology is greatly founded on mythology, spirituality, alchemy, even paranormal elements, this is one of the personality models that allows spirituality to be integrated in. So it is open to spiritual and paranormal processes of human experiences. So there's a thing called synchronicity, which I'll talk about. Let me define the terms first, then I'll get to synchronicity. So parapsychology, that's defined as beyond the typical psychological experience. So some we classify that as clairvoyance, telepathy, or so there's an openness to that. Transpersonal means across persons. So that means there's something greater out there than the individual. So religion and spirituality come in play. And with this, a common uh, thing that occurs when one is experiencing analysis through Jungian analysis is this event of synchronicity. So that means external events are influenced by internal processes. So random occurrences that occur that have real psychological meaning. So for example, if you ever thought of a friend that you haven't talked to in a while, and that friend comes to mind, and then later you get a text from that friend, again, we can never prove it, but that could be a synchronous experience. Or you wake up with a song stuck in your head, you turn on your car radio, that song's playing. Um, that's just a few examples. There can also be others. Again, I could have a dream the night before about a certain image that really terrifies me or scares me, and then could be working with a client, and that client starts talking about that image. In addition, doing work with play therapy, what's really common, and again, can't prove any of this, there's just a framework for it. What's really common is people start utilizing the same figurines throughout the day. So you can't see this, but I have a whole shelves of sand tray figurines. So like the Mothman's one of them, and there's small little like toys and miniatures with this. And there's probably close to 1,000. That may be too much of an estimation. But what's interesting is people throughout the day, it's not uncommon to use the same symbols. So that could possibly be a synchronistic element and reflecting back to the collective unconscious. Now, connected to this, there is a growing field of psychedelic psychotherapy, and that has a lot of roots in transpersonal and Jungian theory to help explain this. So, when I was first started teaching in 2015, psychedelic psychotherapy was not very common, but now I'm certain many of you are already familiar with this. But for those who, I just want to give a quick talk about this because again, this is greatly growing in popularity. So psychedelic psychotherapy is a psychedelic is a term coined by British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. And essentially what psychedelic means, it's visual manifestations of the soul. So this is used to promote personality growth and change. It is a therapeutic modality that's going to combine traditional psychotherapy with the use of entheogens. So those are chemical substances that produce non-ordinary states of consciousness. So this can promote psychological and behavioral change. Right now, the Food and Drug Administration is in phase 3 clinical trials of using MDMA. You may be more familiar with the street term of ecstasy, to help with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In the process too, psilocybin is a psychedelic. You may know it as aka magic mushrooms. That has a plethora of research showing it can help people experience a more meaningful existence, have more what we call peak experiences or spiritual transformations. And those are in the process of being in the FDA clinical trials as well. LSD is another common psychedelic used in therapeutic context, and I'm sure that eventually is going to be going through the FDA clinical trials. So when a drug passes the FDA clinical trials, that means it can be prescribed by a provider. And there again, there is a growing, even in Maine, there is a growing field of using psychedelics to promote growth and change of this. So how this works is there's many models of how to use these substances. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, has a whole protocol or various protocols on their website. But what we're seeing is these can promote personality growth and change, and has a lot of similarities with Jungian. And there's also possibility of literature describing that psychedelic psychotherapy may be helpful in promoting change with someone who is diagnosed with a personality disorder. But that that's a whole other can of worms that it would take like an hour to describe what all that means. But just know this is a growing element. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this, and these integrate quite well with Jungian theory. All right, thank you for this. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm going to stop sharing, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.